Hey there. So this video is the continuation of the last one I posted, titled Knowledge versus Mental Approach in the Craft, Developing Theoretical Models Part 1, which I encourage you to watch first if you haven't yet. I've linked it in the description. And in this follow-up video, I wanted to provide an overview of some of the approaches that I use to leverage what I already know to help produce thoughtful and effective rituals and spells. To be clear, my goal isn't to convince anybody that my specific approaches are ones others should emulate, nor do I think the conclusions I draw are ones others must embrace or apply. Instead, what I hope you'll agree with is that each of us can take advantage of our own knowledge base to gain deeper insight into the potential of our craft, and aid us in personalizing our practice in a way that serves us. In order to do so, I'm going to provide some illustrative examples of how I personally employ previously held knowledge to analyze ritual practices and craft objects. A lot of my analyses will be fairly psych and neuro-focused because that's generally how I roll. But as I mentioned last time, the specific knowledge base one possesses doesn't really matter. The utility of that knowledge is, I think, largely determined by our willingness to practice applying it. So, without further ado, back to where we left off last time. Frowning down at the instructions for a well-known but largely unexplained spell, a half-devoured pen dangling from our mouths, and wondering, why might this spell actually work? Let's pretend what we're reading are the general instructions for making a witch's ladder, which I've picked because I've neither used nor spoken about witches' ladders before, and they're one of those famous spells most of us will have encountered in the 101 books. So, how might a witch's ladder work? First things first, I think it's useful to have a sense of at least a few of your own basic assumptions about how the craft as a whole works. So for instance, when considering how a spell or ritual act may work, I invariably assume that its efficacy must be at least partly attributable to factors that aren't supernatural in any way. This is a function of my own experiences and conclusions about how the world works, and from my point of view, choosing to ignore the full mundane potential of the materials and processes I use in ritual is effectively tantamount to deciding that I'm not all that interested in doing the best job I can. And let's be honest, that's totally true sometimes. I do not aspire to be somebody who always commits 110% of my energies to every project except those involving math. And I don't always care about doing an excellent job. Chill rituals and spells whose goal can be summed up as, if it works, cool, but the process was lovely and affirming, and that's what I really wanted today. Those types of workings absolutely have a place in my practice, just not at the expense of hard-hitting craft that is as powerful as I can possibly make it. But besides being a useful and, I think, solid foundation upon which to build my understanding of my own self, the world, and my craft, this assumption has the added benefit of providing a strategy for seizing the advantage when it comes to analyzing a spell or its materials. Because those factors or features of a spell that are based on the more mundane, and therefore typically better studied and understood, aspects of the physical world and human experience are the factors whose workings and effects I think can probably be manipulated with greatest confidence. These are factors we, that is, humanity, already have an idea of how to tweak in order to influence outcomes in one direction or the other. They're factors for which a non-anecdotal instruction manual, however incomplete, already exists. And so they are factors we should, at least theoretically, be able to apply in our work with roughly the same level of confidence as those who use them for non-spiritual ends. Which means, if I can figure out what some of those mundane factors are that contribute to a spell's efficacy, I can probably improve upon the spell as a whole by tweaking just a few of those factors. Even if the more esoteric or experimental craft techniques I apply in addition completely miss their mark, the mundane aspects are ones that have a good chance of striking my target. A second core assumption I make about spellcraft is this. I tend to assume that popular spells or spell types become popular in part because either their mundane features or their mundane effects influence a large proportion of people the same way. So for instance, I assume that flat-field scrying, such as scrying with the use of a magic mirror, is popular in part because one of the effects of staring at a featureless field is the tendency for the brain to then generate vivid visual imagery in response to the absence of differentiable external visual stimuli. This tendency for the brain to produce vivid visuals in such cases is both common and widespread. It's a quirk of human neural functioning. And so given a couple of attempts, a good proportion of people will experience it. Whatever personal touches you may add to your flat-field scrying ritual, and regardless of whether you believe the visions are messages from divinity, your own forgotten past, or some other source, this one component of the spell, the generation of images as a result of staring at a flat field, works. It works consistently. And, as is often the case, processes that dependably provide an experience that many people are looking for and which help contribute to the outcome people are hoping to achieve are precisely the sorts of things that gain popularity and get passed along to our friends and peers. Thus, I think that flat-field scrying is an example of a spell that's become popular in part because one of its defining effects, having visions, relies on a mundane factor, human visual processing, shared by most people. But what of witches' ladders? A witch's ladder is basically a rope with bits of stuff stuck through it. That's what it is physically at its core. It's been tweaked in many ways by many people over the years. Some braid the rope, add hair, or tie knots in it. Some witches are traditionalists and use only feathers inserted perpendicularly through the rope, while others will use a combination of charms. Whatever. A rope with feathers sticking out is the gist of the prototypical witch's ladder. Where did this prototypical view of the ladder originate? In a sealed-off sub-attic space in Somerset discovered in the late 19th century alongside a half-dozen brooms and a chair. An article describing this item, as well as townfolk's suspicions about its intended use, was published shortly thereafter in the Folklore Journal. Following publication, many shared the belief that its purpose was nefarious, and most, if not all of those suspected purposes were almost certainly untrue. There's frankly little evidence to support the idea that this rope with feathers started out as anything significant or witchy at all, but by gods it certainly became so. And insofar as my own interest in witches' ladders go, the fact that it seemingly originated from something utterly insignificant is irrelevant. I'm much more interested in why and how a bit of string with feathers stuck through it might have come to strike people as significant and become, in time, such a popular tool for modern witches. Now clearly, a witch's ladder doesn't induce the sort of obvious shift in sensory processing that staring at a flat field does. Nor can we say much about the effects of a witch's ladder, because not only do we have no idea what its hypothetically witchy original purpose was, there's no real consensus on its modern-day usage either. These days, witches' ladders get used for all sorts of reasons, which, generally speaking, means its ultimate effect boils down to a means of manifesting some intention. As far as goals go, that's pretty generic. Far too general to be helpful in narrowing down how a witch's ladder might achieve my own ends any better than, say, a candle spell. Having said all that, I do think an argument can be made for the features common to witches' ladders being able to affect many people the same way, particularly if we extend our definition of features to include the context in which it is found, and the way that context interacts with the physical features of the witch's ladder itself. Because context, generally speaking, has a pretty powerful influence on how we experience things. The same teddy bear snuggled up with a peacefully dozing infant is not going to elicit the same response if you instead encounter it alone on a basement shelf next to the gutted remains of Mr. Ducky McSnugglequack. Nor are your responses to the same context likely to remain fixed for all objects, even objects that are categorically similar. Trade out that teddy bear for, say, a Chucky doll, and that sleeping infant scene is, for some of us now, even more horrifying than the demise of Mr. Ducky. All of which is to say that, in considering the object's interaction with its context, we can help narrow down what sort of intentions may be best helped along by the use of a witch's ladder specifically, rather than a candle spell. And so, with this couple of basic assumptions in hand, I can move on to figuring out how I may be able to use a witch's ladder to best effect. One of the approaches I tend to take, and which I've found to be pretty useful, is to break up my brainstorming sessions according to whatever goals I think are implied by my assumptions themselves. This is key, I think, in that it applies regardless of what your background knowledge is or what assumptions you personally make regarding the craft and how it works. The assumptions you make provide an avenue of exploration that leads naturally from the assumptions themselves. So long as you can clearly conceptualize what your assumptions are, they will help guide you in applying your knowledge base to the act of analyzing spells or craft items. So, given my own assumptions, here are 3 goals toward which I can apply my knowledge base when analyzing the witch's ladder. First, I'll try to identify what mundane features of note a witch's ladder possesses. Second, I'll try to figure out what effects those features have on a lot of people. That is, how people react to those features individually and as a whole. And third, I'll try to identify means of maximizing or modifying those features in order to make the witch's ladder even better at doing whatever it is that I've decided it already does pretty well. We've already gone over the features of note, which amount to a rope with feathers poking out that gained notoriety after having been discovered in an abandoned attic. So we can jump straight to the second question. What effects could those features induce in others that might make the witch's ladder a powerful tool for spellcraft? This question is one whose answers would vary drastically based on each of our individual backgrounds. And not only will many seemingly disparate takes on the answers be valid, many of them will simultaneously be very useful. In fact, this entire exercise is one we can repeat several times for the same item or spell, and in each instance come out the other end with an entirely different result. Any single item or spell can have features that elicit different reactions or seem to conflict, or which can clearly be dissociated and sorted into 2 or more themes depending on the specific perspective you find yourself taking. Other times, imperfect knowledge about the item itself may contribute, and that's an idea I'll come back around to later. I don't think that any of this is a problem. I'd argue that allowing yourself to fall into a particular theme naturally is, in fact, ideal. The specific track you find yourself on the first time you brainstorm about an item or spell can help clarify how that spell or item resonates with you and your beliefs and perceptions specifically, at least for the moment and given your present state. And from a practical standpoint, optimizing a spell or item for one specific purpose is, I think, generally going to result in better efficacy than trying to create a kitchen sink spell that does 4 different things all at once. If you wish, you can always go back and reanalyze the same spell or item a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th time to maximize its potential from an entirely different perspective, and thereby create a different version of the thing that's tailored toward a different purpose. Another thing I'd like to note is that while brainstorming about what effects the witch's ladder has on a lot of people, I'm specifically interested in identifying the hypothetical potential of those features, not what effect those features had on, say, the handyman who actually discovered the Somerset ladder itself. I'll try to illustrate what I mean with a few examples of my witch's ladder brainstorming. The workers who found the witch's ladder discovered it in a hidden room they hadn't expected to find, a secret space, whose very existence was a surprise, which is the sort of thing that tends to elicit heightened emotional reactivity, often experienced as anxiety. I suspect this tendency has something to do with the fact that secret rooms imply more than a simple need for privacy. A place whose existence is known, but to which entrance may be denied, is a private space, and anybody who's used a toilet probably accepts the virtue of maintaining just such a spot, even though none could reasonably suggest that the fact that each of us poops is a closely held secret. But a secret space implies that the use to which that place is put is somehow itself atypically unacceptable or unsavory. Which, obviously isn't always true, but it's certainly a common and powerful impression. A hidden room itself would, I expect, generally function as the original trigger for whatever fear or excitement followed. Now, the closed-off attic space reportedly contained little of note upon which to thrust or blame such anxiety. A chair is just a chair. It's too common to be archetypally creepy. But then they saw the brooms. 6 of them. All heavily used and so rotten that the handles disintegrated when touched. Which, by the way, probably accounts for the inception of the idea that the place belonged to a witch, and that everything inside the space did as well. Yet, even though the 6 brooms might serve to support the appropriateness of the increased emotional reactivity stemming from having found a secret space, because witches, as well as to provide a ready clue as to the significance of the only unidentifiable item in the room, ultimately, brooms are ubiquitous. Every household, no doubt, had one. Only the volume and context in which they were found made them notable. And, ultimately, they didn't become the central focus of this historical tale because something else was present that served as an ideal anchor for emotional arousal. Which leads me to the topic of novelty. That is newness, which is a critical feature upon which our brains depend to sort out the meaning and probability of events, the rules of cause and effect. If you go to a buffet and get food poisoning, you'll almost never attribute the sickness to the foods you eat regularly unless those foods were noticeably off while you were eating them. Instead, you and your brainstem will typically place the blame on the least common foods of which you partook. If one of those foods was something you'd never eaten before, poor you. You're almost guaranteed to feel like you're going to puke the next time you smell or taste it. The new, as far as your brain is concerned, is the probable culprit of any unexplained ills. And this holds true even when the negative effects are emotional states rather than physical ones. The rope and feathers, the witch's ladder, was what was new in that attic space. It was unexpected and unfamiliar. It would therefore be easy enough to interpret it as somehow significant, perhaps even a causal source of whatever anxiety or need for caution the discovery of the room itself elicited. But what of the specific construction of the witch's ladder itself? What is creepy about a string and feathers? A few potentially relevant considerations spring to mind. The witch's ladder lacks any immediately apparent use. It has no obvious routine function. Although this is not itself evidence of the thing possessing some explicitly non-routine function, people are more likely to attribute meaning to the trivial than to assume triviality. Its creation was clearly a conscious act. Somebody took the time to collect feathers and either force them through the braided twine or even, based on some statements, construct the rope around the feathers. Either way, effort was expended on a thing with no clear purpose. Again, although everybody's familiar with play and pointless pursuits engaged in simply for the shit of it, we are generally biased toward believing that actions reflect considered intent. Also, the Somerset ladder, it probably wouldn't strike most people as inherently pretty or decorative, which is yet again an implicit argument in favor of the idea that it would indeed have had an explicit function, or at least would be perceived as having had an explicit function. Anyway, you get the gist. I continue brainstorming in this way until I've developed a clear idea of what the features of the witch's ladder seem to me to be particularly well suited for, given my own knowledge and impressions. And by and large, a clear theme develops as a result. You may find some merit in all of my brainstorming notes on the ladder's features. You may think I'm onto something only in points 2 and 3, or you may disagree entirely and feel like I'm completely misrepresenting the discovery of the Somerset ladder, which is cool, because you're probably right about that last part. For all of that, my brainstorming session led me clearly in the direction of identifying what makes the witch's ladder unsettling and why. There's not really a lot of evidence to support the idea that the original discoverers of the string and feathers were all that creeped out by it. For one thing, those crumbling brooms, the owners repurposed them, replacing the handles with new ones so they could put the brooms to good use once more. Although the owner's commitment to recycling is commendable, it's not the sort of behavior you would expect from somebody who actually put any stock in the idea of cursed objects. I mean, I wouldn't willingly reuse Jeffrey Dahmer's vacuum, so if those involved in the discovery of the attic space believed not only that witches were evil, but that they possessed the capacity to willfully spread evil, why on earth would they risk inviting danger into their lives by actually using those brooms? The second point is, it's called a witch's ladder. And it's called that specifically because the gents who found it insisted that it must be a literal ladder used by witches to scrabble across the roof, which, is weird and somewhat revealing about their beliefs regarding the physical construction and mass of the average witch. But as far as conclusions go, it's definitely not all that scary. Thrilling, perhaps, but not the sort of creepy I've been focusing on. In fact, the first recorded suggestion that the witch's ladder might be an object used for cursing and thus worthy of something approaching fear has been attributed to an anthropologist at Cambridge and not to those who actually found the item. Likewise, most of the nefarious magical associations that came to be ascribed to the witch's ladder were developed years and decades after the fact, during the course of academic what-ifing, with a generous sprinkling of questionable interview practices thrown in, and a whole lot of comparing and contrasting with the use of ropes, garlands, and feathers in other mystical traditions. All of which is to say, while my little exercise in brainstorming has certainly provided me with both a list of the witch's ladder's features of note, as well as a list of effects those features could be anticipated to induce in people, including myself, given its discovery within a particular context, it has most definitely not provided an answer to the mystery of what a witch's ladder was originally for, nor how the discovery of the witch's ladder truly unfolded. The psychological effects I've attributed to the witch's ladder are entirely hypothetical ones, effects that are possible, not necessarily all ones that happened during the first encounter. I'm trying to figure out one particular thing they can do, with a strong focus on what they elicit in me, and then figure out why they might achieve this effect in myself and others so that I can then make my own witch's ladder even better at achieving that effect. Its value to me is in the potential born of its unique combination of features, and the effects the ladder can have as a whole, depending on what features I include and which I exclude. When you come right down to it, all I've done is use the prototypical witch's ladder and its history and mythos, some true, some popularly imagined or exaggerated, as a jumping-off point for designing a new spell item of my own that is suited to a specific purpose, which is precisely the same approach I used when considering the utility of talismans for inducing past states. Only in my Talismans and Context video, I focused on presenting one rationale for their use rather than the process I used to develop the idea. In both cases, I've engaged in the craft equivalent of a movie based on true events. The item might be inspired by a real-world example, but damned if I didn't ignore inconvenient historical details in the service of producing a product that sends the message I want it to. What my brainstorming about the Somerset Witch's Ladder has revealed to me is that, for my own personal purposes, I readily and immediately respond to the Witch's Ladder as a sort of "Danger, Will Robinson!" for an imagined witch's turf. My thoughts about it skewed instantaneously toward all of the ways in which I imagined it could induce hesitation in those who saw it, or be assigned responsibility for their anxieties. And I then identified which features helped to account for this view, this reaction. That is to say, I worked to identify how a witch's ladder might achieve these feats. This included its ability to draw attention to itself to a greater extent than its surroundings, its lack of any obvious aesthetic value, the fact that it's a seemingly purposefully built item with no clear purpose to non-witchy folk anyway, its discovery in an unexpected place, the implication that its abandonment in a space was considered and purposeful, its novelty and therefore its capacity to act as an anchor or perceived source of the emotions elicited within its environment or immediate surroundings, its ability to evoke ritual acts through the incorporation of materials themselves associated with ritualized behavior such as animal parts like feathers, etc., and so on. And so now, with all of these features of note and their probable effects in pocket, I'm in a position to move on to the third step of this crafty thought process, determining how I can modify these features I've identified to make them even better at doing whatever it is that they do. And when I say whatever they do, what I really mean is what I've decided a witch's ladder is probably well suited to doing based on my own interpretation of its strengths and potential, which in my case means using the witch's ladder as a ritual object designed to act as a guardian of sacred space. The sort of thing that might be hung from a tree branch at a forest clearing, or from the ceiling of a room that is meant to remain closed to guests, in order to signal to any who stumble upon it that this place is claimed, is to be respected, by inducing the sense that failure to do so just might result in something you won't really like. Importantly, the analyses I've presented thus far have all fallen within the realm of mundane features, studies of the object from the point of view of psychological association, implication, and potential. In your own case, they may be examinations based on your knowledge of history or sculpture, of literature, and these fields' own associations, implications, and potential. The more traditionally crafty aspects of intention setting, charging, devotion, what have you, would of course be optimized via their own brainstorming session and are part and parcel of the third step in the process. The actual modification of features, or the process of improving upon those I choose to include and excluding those I've decided are counterproductive to my goals, involves nothing more than a bit more brainstorming, more creative contemplation. For instance, for my own witch's ladder, I might decide to rely heavily on natural materials and to use a variety of objects rather than only feathers, because using a variety of primarily organic materials will help to reinforce the notion that the object was indeed purposefully made and is closely bound to the ritualized or even primal use of flora and fauna. Likewise, I may decide that the inclusion of at least one seemingly valuable, if not objectively precious, item would further drive home the impression that my witch's ladder is purposeful and significant, since people only infrequently part with valuable items on a whim. This one semi-valuable item probably shouldn't be something too pretty, though. That would set the wrong tone and perhaps even inspire somebody to rescue the bit of shiny from my ladder. I may choose to include some sort of noise-making aspect, a chime that rings flat, or a tube that magnifies and transforms the sound of the breeze, to bolster my witch's ladder's capacity to draw attention and unnerve through a second sensory modality, hearing. Ultimately, because so much of the power of the witch's ladder is, for me, based upon its ability to reflect and intensify the feeling of the environment in which it's found, I would almost certainly only design it in earnest after I knew where exactly I wanted to place this guardian of sacred space. in echoing aspects of that space in the design of the ladder itself, including the incorporation of materials found in that space, the link between the ladder and its territory could be further strengthened, and so forth until my own riff on the spell comes together. If you decide to use this sort of process, you obviously shouldn't feel limited to optimizing whatever features you include using only mundane means. This third step is the one that, in my opinion, benefits most greatly from the incorporation of whatever craft methods you prefer to apply to creating spells or spell items. This is the point during the design process when I begin leaning on my craft-related knowledge, theory, and resources, even while my goal remains to optimize the mundane features of my spell. Only once those mundane features are dealt with do I, personally, focus primarily on the craftier side and the way in which the more spiritual, witchy aspects will interact with the mundane ones. The careful consideration given to the mundane features of the Witch's Ladder aren't meant to lessen or invalidate the importance of the mystical items or acts that one includes in addition, but to maximize their efficacy, to carry their own weight and then some. The focus on mundane features is a means of making use out of mundane knowledge. So if I had to choose a single takeaway message from today's little chat, it would be this: there is no spell or tool that cannot be improved upon by mundane means, using whatever mundane knowledge we possess. And with that, I bid you adieu for now. Until next time, I wish you a most wonderful day.